We're going to think about God. Pretty big, isn't he, God?
Paul Newbold is a primary school teacher who uses big thinking techniques in an RE context to help enable his Year 1 pupils' deep thinking. For this programme, we've brought together Paul with Kim Porter, a primary teacher who helped develop his lesson. Will Ord is a leading trainer in philosophy for children, an initiative to incorporate important philosophical and intellectual skills into pupils' learning. Julie Grove is a former head of the Association of RE Inspectors, Advisors and Consultants. They'll view Paul's lesson, give some expert guidance and discuss generally how primary teachers can best get pupils to ask big questions.
I'm really interested in how a non-special teacher of RE can best plan for, manage and assess good RE and create space and opportunities for children to really think for themselves, ask big questions and feel valued in that process.
What struck me was the atmosphere of the room. There was clearly an interest and a will to think, so there must have been some good preparatory grounds made for that.
The thinking was not confined. There was an ongoing discussion as they were working. And challenging when some people consider that young children can't think at all beyond the concrete.
What I saw was a tremendous opportunity to develop in those young children the capacity to think. The question for me is it good RE? And I want to come back to that and think about how the planning might perhaps strengthen that opportunity for thinking by perhaps using the religious material in a different way.
The religious content, the Christian content within the context of this are the two great commandments of Jesus, love God, love your neighbour. How would you take that sort of religious content, Julie? Well, how would you do it from your point of view if you were giving that more prominence at the start of the planning? How would you do it?
Well, I would use the story. Some of the issues that you and the children explored were based on assumptions about the existence of God and about faith in God. The children were all signed up to that, and with very young children we know that if we're going to bring them into this religious world, we need also to distance them from it. We need to safeguard their backgrounds. What we can do is to draw out the big questions from stories. And indeed, the relationship between AT1 and AT2 is precisely that. It's having some content first, which children can then process and do the learning from.
I wanted them to very much think for themselves about rules and the importance of rules in their lives. But in the context of RE, I wanted them also to think about God in that context. I wanted them to think about how we, when we make choices, are guided by something outside of ourselves. And so obviously I did lead them towards the idea of God, and then questions about the nature of God came from that as well.
Do you think that every lesson must have RE knowledge at the end of each lesson to count as an RE lesson as such?
I think that I'm not suggesting that RE has to be content focused necessarily. But I think if it's only skills focused, then there's a danger that it can be PSHE citizenship. And all I'm saying is that in RE lessons, because this time is really precious and we have to make the best of it, let's look at using the religious material in a way which really promotes children's thinking.
Would it be worth considering, how about have a theme or a skill as a driving force for your scheme of work, and still look at all the content you want, but the emphasis or the priority in the teacher's mind at least is they must be able to listen and respect by the end of this year?
Whether you choose to start with skills or whether you choose to start with context has a lot to do with the age of the children, has a lot to do with the ability of the children that you're working with, but also it has something to do with the subject matter. So if there is something where artefacts are a key part of what you're doing, that's a very concrete place to start for children, isn't it?
I think you, as a teacher, need to have fairly secure intentions, objectives. This is where I would like children to be by the end of the lesson. And in my experience, it's helpful to non-specialists to have those three hooks to hang it onto. Know, understand, and have the opportunity and be able to reflect on. That seems to work really well, because it's pretty challenging stuff, and it's ever so easy to get lost in it as a teacher, unless you have that path.
Home in now on the managing the lesson and how a teacher can best, in my terms, create space for the kind of thinking that is genuinely a part of good RE.
And so often, when a teacher asks a question, the few keen hands go up, you go to the reliable keenies to say, what do you think? And that actually shuts off the thinking of others. So the holding time, I think, is critical. And to explain to them that perhaps the little bit longer that we think, the better the thought will be. Practical strategies would be to hand each participant or class member 3 cards each of a pack of cards, and that's how many times they can contribute during the class dialogue. So it's equal, but it makes the louder ones think a little bit more carefully about when they spend that card.
Julie, in terms of the language of the teacher and the way that the teacher draws out responses from the pupils, it is hard, particularly with younger children.
I think the biggest pitfall is thinking that the children won't manage the language, won't manage the vocabulary, and therefore we won't use it. Young children love the sound of words. And when you have told and introduced children to a number of images, if you like, which go with a word like revelation, and then you have a child saying to you, Mrs. Grove, are we going to have another story about Revelation today? Then suddenly you think, yes, it's working, and I've given that child a tool in the form of that word, and those become then the building blocks for some of the concept development later on.
To build on Julie's point there is to perhaps introduce children not only to the vocabulary that has a religious connotation, but also the vocabulary that allows them to challenge questions. If they have that vocabulary, when it comes to those questions like, where is God? A child might be able to say, well, does that take for granted, or does that assume that God exists?
I would go further back, because I think if you do not have the words, sometimes you cannot have the thoughts, and particularly with children with learning difficulties. If they have not been given the tools with which to think, which includes the vocabulary, then you actually are short-circuiting their thinking, and you're not giving them the opportunity to really make the most of their skills.
I think as well, though, it's worth pointing out that some of the questions we don't need to try and answer them. Posing them, framing them, is sometimes all we can do, and then thinking about them.
And that's what I think Paul was really working hard on, really well there, was to say, now hold on, it's all right not to have an answer, and it's all right to be confused. It doesn't mean you're failing. Actually, confusing means you're on the edge of deeper understanding. If you're very clear about something, you're very often not learning anything at all.
Let's move to the end process. What I'm thinking most about, and I have questions in my head about, is assessment for learning, assessment which genuinely informs the next stage for the teacher.
I think very broadly to consider the who, how and what of assessment for learning. So who might be doing it, self-assessment, peer assessment, you of them, or indeed them of you. The how, it might be assessment for learning in terms of the community, the group as a whole. How are they getting on? For example, are there tensions and difficulties that are preventing a lot of them from speaking or thinking in some way? Or indeed, you might want assessment for learning for specific individuals. But then there's the what might you focus on? Say that priority as a next step for that group has been listening. Just keep life simple and focus on one or two targets. One might be a process or skill target like better listening, and one might be a content target like something about the concept of God or rules for living. So what kind of questions can you ask which will check for listening? So it might be, does anyone agree with that? Now that question is a listening, checking question, as opposed to, has someone got an idea here, which is not.
I'm a big devotee of the I can statement type of approach, where you might have your objectives at the beginning of a lesson and you might think, right, most children will be able to do this by the end of the lesson, some will be able to do this and some will not have achieved that. So you might formulate your I can statements from those initial objectives. So it will be an activity that at some point in it I will be asking a question where the children show me what they've understood of what we've been looking at, whether or not they've been able to process that information or have they just kept it at arm's length. And I will also be looking for some sort of creative use of that information, or has it just been given to them and there it sits like an undigested bit of beef, giving them nightmares.
And how do you evaluate, how do you assess how a young child is talking about God and the level of their thinking in relation to religion?
I'm not sure you can. I think there are some things that we have to say, okay, we set out to stimulate children's thinking about whatever, and it might be about what God might be like. And we might look at their answers and determine what their level of response is in terms of whether they stay within the content that we've shared with them, whether they apply their thinking and offer their own ideas, whether they recognise that people have different kinds of ideas. I mean, those are maybe stages in a process, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's possible to put a number, a level, on thinking about the biggest concept of all.
I think that RE is a creative oasis in the middle of our current syllabus. I do think it's a place for children to be secure, to know that they can be valued, to know that their opinions are welcomed. And it's a creative place, a place to explore different strategies.
Well, I think I would fall back on that Socratic position of saying, I know, I don't know. If you have an open, inquiring approach that is openly with the children saying, well, I don't know, this is a philosophical question, where can we go together with this? Then I think that relieves a lot of the pressure of having to be an expert. Teachers may know more, they may have more experience, but the speed and imagination and the creativity of the minds in front of them might far outstrip them.
I think it's ever so important that your children, these little stars, go on into year 2 and continue to work in this way. And I think your big task is to enthuse your colleagues with this approach. Not exclusively in RE, but RE is leading the way here in developing children's thinking.
Well, I think there's a real feast there of things that we've talked about that I think that the RE, non-specialist RE teacher would have a lot to learn from. But the thing that stays with me is that you've never quite learnt it, have you? There's always more to learn. So thank you very much.